That's what history is.
Welcome to this episode of Dadbod History, where the drinks are cold and the takes are old. Today we have a special guest, Jackson van Uden, author of The Crystallization of Totalitarianism, How the 1953 Conference on Totalitarianism Defined the Term. Jackson, thank you very much for joining us. I'm Jake. We got Eric here. How you doing? What time is it over there right now?
Right now it's 4 o'clock, but thank you very much for having me on. It's a pleasure to be on here.
Excellent. So you have this book that you wrote and published, The Crystallization of Totalitarianism. And, we read it, and it's a fascinating read because I don't know if you meant to do it this way, but I was reading it and it almost began reading, your first sentence is your interest in totalitarianism initially began after reading George Orwell's 1984. And can you go into a little bit more detail on that? Because I want to follow up on that point later. But is that what started this all, was Orwell?
Yeah, pretty much. I think I was about 15, and I saw a censored edition of the Penguin copy, the one with the blacked out writing and everything. And I read it and just fell in love with it. And I actually collect 1984 covers now. So
you collect the covers? What is that?
Yeah, so I collect the books, but I have different covers for every single one. So
like for different editions?
Yeah.
Okay.
So I think I've got 9 different copies now. So that kind of what sparked it, because I was just so fascinated about how every facet of his life is being watched and controlled. And even when he thought he had freedom, he was still being observed.
Yeah.
So that just kind of kicked it off. And I was like, well, how there are regimes like this, what do they actually do and how do they actually operate?
Well, and that brings me to my second question is, Eric and I and Brees, up a couple months ago, we did an episode on 1984 and just kind of did a review of the book and its implications for today. But reading your book, and obviously your book's a lot more academic, but it was almost like reading a primer for totalitarianism. And it was like so much of the stuff, I'm like, well, this is thought crime, and these are the thought police, and these are the ministries of INGSOC. And it was so fast. And obviously Orwell lived it, so he knows totalitarianism, but it was so interesting how he wasn't just making stuff up, I guess is the way to put it. Like his book, 1984, it drew a lot of parallels from what was discussed at this conference.
Oh, 100%. And Orwell, even as a communist, socialist, whatever you want to label him, he was acutely aware of the dangers of where these things can go.
Sure.
And he was even witnessing the USSR get into this point. He had seen the Great Purges of the 30s and saw what that could do to the rest of society. And it was kind of a warning, really, of which this conference was as well. So it's quite interesting. Like you said, the parallels between Orwell and the conferences.
Yeah. It was eerie because the parallels were there, and it was really a good read in that regard. Like it was engaging because I'm like, oh, wow, this all connects. So I guess what I pulled from the book is that there's 2 at least dominant definitions of totalitarianism that seem to have come out of this conference. One was by George Kennan, and the other was by Carl Friedrich. And they both had kind of these defining terms of what would make a totalitarian government. Kennan said monopolistic control of weaponry, transportation, communication, preemptive, prophylactic system of terror, and then ruthless, arbitrary exercise of power. And then Friedrich, similarly, he said there's an official state ideology, a single mass party, technologically conditioned near monopoly of all armed combat, conditioned monopoly of mass communication, and a terroristic system of control. So that control, that constant surveillance, and that control of all communication seem to run parallel in both of these definitions.
Yeah, it's fascinating, really, because they both lived it, but from different perspectives. Friedrich was German, and
Mhm.
he had witnessed the Nazis, and he managed to escape from them. So that's kind of
Mhm.
built from his experience.
Mhm.
But also, Kennan was a diplomat, and he had experienced the totalitarianism of the Baltic states and other Eastern European states, and Russia as well. So
Yeah.
it's very interesting how these definitions are built from lived experiences in different systems, but there's still huge amount of similarities between them.
Yeah. Well, and I want to throw it to Eric, because Eric, you've got a lot more focus on World War II than I do. But just in your reading, Jackson, of the book, but you see the Nazis and their propaganda. I think it was Goebbels, right? He was the big propagandist for the Nazi regime. And similarly, Stalin had his own propaganda arm, and they, conveyed a specific message that followed the party line. And if you veered outside of that, or if you tried to get information elsewhere, it was violently suppressed. And Eric, can you, I guess, add a couple thoughts on that, at least?
Well, one of the Carl Friedrich mentioned that the Nazis and Soviets are basically alike, and that was something you mentioned in the book. And when you look at these two regimes, they seem very similar in terms of how they went about their business. The only difference was what they were aiming at, right? Hitler wanted a capitalistic society. Stalin wanted a socialist society. I guess my follow-up question to that is, at what point does it not matter what your goal is? At what point do your means become the ends?
I think what kind of sets him back is Hitler actually had the war, which kind of interrupted his end. So we don't get to see the end goal of Nazism. We kind of know what it is, but we don't get to see that compared to Stalin. But I think with Stalin, we kind of see that he kind of abandons and changes what he's doing so many times, that it's all about just pushing Russia forward. And it's the same with Hitler. It's all about pushing Germany forward and rebuilding from a collapse of something. So we see the collapse of Weimar Germany. You see the collapse of Tsarist Russia. So there are massive similarities. And I think the means of just killing people to them end up to a similar end of just an advanced, superior nation that is a world superpower that dominates the world, politically and economically.
When you just mentioned it, and I did have a note that I highlighted in the book about the fact that both of these nations came out of a very recent collapse of a monarchy, very strong monarchy. And it just brought into my head, I don't know if you've read Erich Fromm's Escape from Freedom, where he argues that the reason you end up with some of these kind of socialist or totalitarian states is that people, in some sense, don't really want to be completely free. And so when you look at Germany and Russia, they're coming out of monarchies that had a lot of control. Is it the swing into an open system just couldn't be handled by those populations at the time?
I think there's kind of a blind reaction of just walking into something of, anything is better than what we just had. The Germans have just experienced hyperinflation, massive economic crash, and Hitler's offering, and the Nazi Party are offering something that speaks to them, something that's different, and they can see an end goal which is better, and they're thinking, well, we always have coalitions, so the coalition will deal with the policies that we don't like, and we'll have everything we want. So there's that kind of everyone's walking that way, and not realizing that the coalition's not going to be strong enough to deal with him, and they're going to get all the policies they don't like, and they'll just have to live with them. Similarly in Russia as well, there's a little bit of difference as in terms it's a revolution, it's not democratic, but to a lot of Russians at that point, anything was better than Tsar Nicholas II. I'm sure you guys know, and most of your listeners know, that Tsar Nicholas II was pretty much hopeless.
He was.
We've actually gone into that a bit.
He was, he was not his father, basically, right? Yeah. Alexander, who was a very powerful, effective ruler of a vast empire, and Nicholas just couldn't handle the pressure, which shows the fragility of absolute monarchies, because And it kind of shows, after reading the book, it shows the fragility of totalitarian regimes. Because once Stalin died, that was the beginning of the end for the Soviets. I mean, yeah, they were still very powerful up until the 80s, but nobody was Stalin. I mean, nobody else captured that magnetism that Stalin had. And
we also never really get to see what happens after Hitler, because within a week of Hitler dying, I believe it's Karl Donitz is the one who's left, and his first move is to surrender. So because they were at war, had Nazi Germany never been at war, we could have seen how does a personality cult transfer power, and we never got to see that. Thankfully, we never got to see that, but
yeah,
that would have been a different look than what we saw with the Soviets.
Yeah, I think what's really, like I said earlier, what's really interesting about the whole thing is that Nazis, we don't see where the Nazis go. We don't see what happens to Nazi Germany because they lost. And there are at different stages of totalitarianism as well. Germany was already industrialized, so they're moving forward with rebuilding. Meanwhile, Stalin had to industrialize Russia and push through. But I think we see with the handover of that personality cult, I think China is a really good example of how to manage that and how to work through that. Because Mao died, it's passed on, and Xi Jinping is still kind of seen as totalitarian now, and that's mathematically 60 years. Since Mao was in power. So, there's you can kind of see how these things pass on.
Well, and it's funny because I think towards the end you were talking about, I forgot his first name, but it was Deutsch, and he was talking about that, like he accurately predicted the disintegration of the USSR, but not that of China or North Korea. And in fact, China has become more stable and more powerful and more influential as time has worn on. And they're still a very totalitarian regime, and it's very interesting how in Russia they fell, and the satellites of a lot of Eastern Europe fell once Russia fell, and obviously the Nazis were defeated, but China is just chugging along there, and they're kind of an exception to that disintegration that was predicted.
I think China kind of learned the lessons that were on display. They'd witnessed the USSR kind of give too much liberalization and then not be able to claw its way back. Meanwhile, I speak about the Fang Shou cycle, which is where the Chinese gave relative periods of relaxation. So you could enjoy life, a little bit of liberalization, but then they gave the close. So after so long, they kind of closed up, tightened up their laws and their openness, liberalization, and punish people for things that 5 years later. So it gives that little bit of hope that.
Well, that's something you brought up in the book, and I don't remember who it was, but you said the effects of a terroristic police force kind of dull over time, and so you got to mix it with periods of calm, because if it's just going to be this forever, then the people will start pushing back, or it's just not as effective. And so they would have these intentional periods of stability and calm, and then they, like you just said, they could ramp it up to make sure people knew, hey, we're still in charge here.
I mean, yeah, that was Stalin. Stalin was so brutal for periods of time, and then he just wouldn't kill as many people. I'm not going to say
it was a scale.
So yeah, you get these periods, and I find those really quite interesting because you go from the knock in the middle of the night to something different, which is just a little bit more political.
That's very true. It's so interesting because growing up in America, which is a modern Western style democracy, and the same thing with the UK, it's funny to at least for me to kind of relegate authoritarians and totalitarians to the dustbin of history. It's like, well, that never has happened here, but it wasn't that long ago. And it's kind of, if you're not vigilant, it could happen here. And it's just an interesting, it was a good reminder to read this book and go, oh yeah, these are, whether or not you got a Stalin coming in as the next prime minister of the UK or the next president of the United States, you do have these things where you can do mass surveillance and the use of the police force. Those are very authoritarian trends that need to be guarded against.
And I think that was part of my reason for wanting to publish it, because I'd done so much of this research for my dissertation. I was like, actually, there's things that I want to teach people about. There's things that I think people should be aware of, and things that downright irritate me of reading. Like I say in the book, Trump was not a totalitarian. I don't care how many times someone tweets Trump's totalitarian. He wasn't. He just had authoritarian tendencies. He was someone who liked control. So for me, letting people know what totalitarianism is was a huge, huge reason for wanting to put that out, because it's important to me. Well,
it's a word that gets thrown around and misused all the time. And the same thing goes with fascist, right? Oh, well, you're a fascist.
Oh, yeah,
it's like it's an easy dig. It's an easy label to throw on people, but it's so misunderstood that when you do that, it becomes of no value as a word.
I mean, it sounds like you might need a conference to define the term.
Yeah. Right? Yeah. You need a bunch of academics to have a conference. Yeah, exactly.
So let me ask you this. You say, Trump is not a totalitarian, and I'll agree with you. So is it the mechanics and the institutions that prevent that from actually being the case?
Well, first of all, Trump was elected, and Trump was elected out of office. Anyone who firstly can be elected and still be kind of restrained and then elected out of office has a power that they are beholden to. They're not beholden to just themselves like Stalin was or so on. They are not the ultimate power. So in that respect, he's not a totalitarian. He did not have a monopolization of arms. You guys have the right to bear arms and a well-regulated militia. Therefore, one tendency can't be. Doesn't have a monopoly on communications. As much as he tried to do, he couldn't get Microsoft to buy TikTok or to control Facebook or whatever.
Forgot about that. Yeah.
And Jack just kicked him off Twitter too. So
yeah.
Exactly. So there's two things there, and I haven't read a copy, but as many people who own The Art of the Deal is not a doctrinal body of work. There is not there's not one single mass party. There's two parties with little shoot-offs that half of which don't like him. And then, economically, he doesn't have massive control either, or had massive control. That's in the hands of the US Treasury and big multinational corporations. So there's so many ways to say he's not totalitarian. Just because you don't like him doesn't mean you can brand him with that.
Now, conversely, you mentioned this in the book, Vladimir Putin is centralizing authority around Vladimir Putin, and he keeps changing the constitution or the Duma and making it so basically he's president or dictator for life. And he doesn't only have authoritarian tendencies, he's putting a lot of muscle behind those tendencies to promise this nationalistic resurgent Russia, right? And bring back the glory of the USSR, if not the name.
Yeah, I mentioned he was marching Russia back to totalitarianism. They have democracy, if that's what you call it. But he's locking up political opponents. He's poisoned people. Well, people have fallen ill who have opposed his democratic will. He has control of the oligarchs, which in turn means he controls economically. He is definitely getting on the way to it. If not, he's already there. So I think Putin is most definitely a totalitarian leader.
Mhm.
And he's not the only one in Europe as well. I mean, only what month is it? Oh Christ, it's November. 6 months ago, I think, Alexander Lukashenko in Belarus was declared a totalitarian leader by the UN. So it is something that there is a resurgence in it.
Yeah, definitely. And there's a close ties between Lukashenko and Putin in that regard. I mean, they're on very friendly terms.
So you mentioned the UN declared him a totalitarian dictator. Is that something the UN does? Do they sit down? Do they take a look at this committee's definition and say, this person meets those criteria, so we're going to just put out a statement on that?
Well, there's so many different theories on what totalitarianism is. Firstly, because Lukashenko went and depressed a democratic election, I think the UN were well within their rights to say that he was totalitarian. He definitely suppressed democracy, and he used the secret police to kind of enforce it. But on the theories, there are several different. So for me, the Brzezinski and Friedrich definition from the 60s is the 6 characteristics is definitely probably my preferred. But there's other theories to say, if someone in a country says that their leader is totalitarian, who am I to go against their opinion, like their lived experience? The people in this conference came up with these definitions. They were political theorists, philosophers and scientists, but they have lived experiences. Hannah Arendt experienced totalitarianism, so did Friedrich, so did Kennan, so did Glicksman, and all those people. But who am I to deny someone's experience if they say they're living underneath it? And then there's Raymond Aron's definition, which is in the footnotes later on in the book. And so is Lev Gudkov's, that is more Soviet-centric. So there's so many different theories. And, in 5 years' time, 20 years' time, and so on, we might have Chinese scholars coming out and saying this is what totalitarianism is. We might have North Korean scholars coming out and say this is what it is. So it's an evolving thing. But yeah, the UN are definitely within their right.
But even within that evolving thing, these common threads keep creeping up. The control of media, the control of economy, the control of all armed forces. I mean, all those things, whether it's Russian, German, Chinese, or someone else, it is very, the flavor might be different, but the main substance is basically the same. They all use the same playbook, so to speak, on how to centralize power around themselves or the party.
Yeah, definitely the same playbook. And I like the idea about flavor as well. I should have used that.
That'll be the next edition. You can just
But you only need to look at Kim Jong-il. Oh no, Kim Jong-un. It's Kim Jong-un now. You only need to look at Kim Jong-un and see the kind of playbook that he's following. He's following that Soviet style, the Chinese style on how to do it. He even, mid-pandemic or the beginning of the pandemic, he faked his own death to find out who would try and usurp his power. And then he was like, oh no, actually I'm alive, and just purged everyone. So, he is using these things to kind of consolidate power and remove political opponents.
I was just going to ask you a question, because as I was reading this, I was like, well, what's the best way to combat this? I guess, like, how do we make sure that we guard against it? I mean, it's good that the UN can declare these things, and I'm not a big fan of invading countries, even if they are authoritarian or otherwise. So what's the best way to combat the rise of totalitarianism in the world? Because it sure seems like it ain't going away.
The thing is, like, just read information and be aware of what's happening. But also be aware of what the limit is. You can't just run around branding people totalitarian all the time. Otherwise, the term's going to be softened and it's just not going to work. So, being acutely aware of what's going on and reading and questioning things. Why are we doing this? Why has that happened? And then you can kind of get a gist of, actually, this is a path that I don't want things to go down. I'm going to try and do something about it. And then globally, just being aware of these issues. Unfortunately, we as a Western international community have kind of allowed it to happen, because we just let China move on, because we were like, well, it's not too much of a threat right now, so we'll just leave it. And then it got to a point it was like, well, if we invade, we'll be in massive trouble with the Russians, so we'll just leave it. So there's only so much international pressure can do. You just have to help the people in these countries, because that's what happened with Russia. Russia had increased liberalization, increased knowledge, increased awareness of what was going on outside, that they started to question things. And that's why there's stuff such as like leaflet drops, USB stick drops, radio drops in North Korea, because Radio Free Europe, I think it was called, helped Eastern Europe kind of be aware of what was going on.
Yeah, it's a good way. It's anecdotal, but I believe it was during Khrushchev's time as the premier in Russia, and he came to the United States, and they took him to a grocery store in America, and it was just filled with grocery. Like, it was packed to the gills. Whereas in Russia, everything was spare, and there was bread lines, and so like America's ability to feed its people had more of an impact on the destabilization of Russia than all the bombs or all the tanks or all the soldiers ever would, because it showed them, in a way, this is a better option. And you can have this option if you push for it.
Yeah, exactly. And it took another 40 years after Khrushchev.
Yeah, it didn't happen fast.
Yeah, but there was an increased awareness of what was going on outside. And, we see it in 1984. Winston has an increased awareness and then begins to question things. So Orwell, again, was ahead of his time and aware of these things. But also, if you go too far within these states, there are punishments to be had. Quite often in North Korea, the people who defect are the diplomats who are working abroad, or the people who worked as loggers in the western side of Russia.
Okay.
Or is it the eastern side? Sorry. So these people who became more aware were the first to kind of quit, and then their families were punished.
Yeah, that's a good point. Eric, did you have any other questions?
Well, I know one of the things we looked into, or when we were reading about this, is just kind of totalitarian regimes often find it necessary to co-opt religion within those countries. Katie, tell us a little bit more about how that works and why that seems necessary.
So, religion is something that people totally build their life around, and tend to have dogmatic beliefs about. You go to church every Sunday. You fulfill these kind of like daily routines. You pray and so on, and it affects the totality of the system if you have something else that you believe in. Especially in Stalin's Russia, is everything was about the system, and Stalin was the person who gave you your bread and so on. So he was the one who was in charge. Religion affected that totality, because people didn't thank Stalin and the state for what they had. They thanked God. And that, it's not Russia. It's not communism. And communism is inherently atheist anyway. So to remove the religious aspect from communist totalitarianism helped with the system, because you remove that total influence from someone's life, so they are beholden.
Although in the book, and I'll just say it and hand it off to you and Eric, Stalin eventually kind of liked the idea of being deified, right? You said initially he pushed back against that, but then he's like, hey, this isn't so bad. I mean, there is no God, but I am God, sort of thing. And I just thought that was a fascinating twist. Like, you can take the religion out of Russia, kind of, but it'll, in a way, it's going to implant itself on to someone or something. If you remove the church aspect, people will find a way to
something to worship,
to co-opt that. Yeah, to work. Yeah, that's a great way to put it.
People need something. And if Stalin is the one who's delivering you something, and he's the one who's calling a halt to all these arrests, well, then he's the one who saved you. So it's those little things, those little hopes that people wanted and people needed. Most of the great dictators in the world, or great, I don't know why I said great, but most of the most notorious dictators in the world have had a cult of personality. The Kim dynasty, Mao, Stalin. There was a slight one over Hitler, but that was, again, a fascist totalitarian state, so it's slightly different. But yeah, there's still cult personality around these people.
Well, in the revisionist history, Stalin revising Trotsky's accomplishments to be his own. Same thing with History Begins at Mao. And the more I thought about it, it's more going back to 1984 is I love Big Brother, right? At some point, Big Brother, whether or not Big Brother was ever really a person, transcended the physical realm and became whatever their god or their worship object was.
Yeah, I mean, you see that with Stalin, is that Stalin just becomes this almighty, omnipotent, omnipresent feature of Stalinism in Russia. People have his portraits in their houses. People had a pin of Mao on their jackets, and that's something that not only transcends the system, but it goes into you being there all the time, and it subconsciously, you'll behave because you're like, well, Stalin's up on the wall. I don't want to misbehave in front of Stalin. Mao's on my chest. I'm not gonna misbehave in front of Mao. Yeah, and it just kind of feeds into that.
Yeah, it's such an interesting dynamic. Again, anecdotal. And years ago, it just came into my head. I remember either reading something or seeing on the news that North Korea, Kim Jong-un, said there was only certain approved haircuts for men, and they had to be his haircut. You had to dress like him. You had to look like him. Everything about it was in idolation of this person, which works if the person is strong, like a Stalin or a Mao. But what if Stalin dies? Well, then God is dead. And then what do you do? You've built the whole system on one man, and that's a very dangerous system to have.
And on Khrushchev's de-Stalinization, it must have been quite difficult for some of these Russians to de-Stalinize their places, to take the statues down, to remove the pictures, because that's the person you've worshipped for the best part of 30 years.
Yeah.
And to suddenly see that statue come down, to suddenly see everything just collapse, it's difficult. And again, Stalin's death, really well satiricalized in the Death of Stalin movie, even though it's not 100% factually correct, kind of shows that grief that people had towards Stalin's death. And same thing with Kim Jong-il. He was deified to that extent that North Koreans didn't think that he went to the toilet. And
I didn't know that.
So those kind of things are like, well, why are we perpetuating that? And again, it's that godlike deification of these people.
Yeah. Go ahead, Eric.
If you had a question on the book, Jake, I was going to get some other questions. So you mentioned 1984. I think we all love 1984. It's pretty fantastic. Besides 1984, what's a book that has kind of influenced you, whether it's about totalitarianism or just in general? What's a book that you think is just the best?
The book Stoner. I can't remember who wrote Stoner, but it's just really, really left a mark on me because it's just so fantastically written. And it goes through this man's life. Nothing remarkable happens. He moves out to a small town. He becomes a university professor. He gets married. No, it just goes through his life. And for a book so mundane, it was really, really well written. I just kept wanting to read it. And then secondly, The Great Expectations by Charles Dickens, because I stormed into my mum and dad's room at the end of it and was like, what the hell's going on here? Why did he do that? Bit like something from Silver Lion's playbook where he throws the book out the window. But yeah, those two books.
Awesome. Thank you.
And we didn't get a whole lot into you. Where are you at in the UK, and what is your next step after this book?
Yeah, so I'm based in, obviously, the UK. I'm based in East Anglia, East Midlands. The right hand, the bit that juts out, I'm in that bit. About half an hour north of Cambridge, which for us is a long drive. And yeah, I'm currently doing like teacher training, so I'm a history teacher at the moment. And next step is just to kind of take a little research break and then jump on to writing more about totalitarianism, because it's such a fascinating area of history, and people need to know about it. So yeah, working in that area.
Very good. Jake, did you have any fun questions?
Okay, yeah. So all right, which I got. So something that we've kind of got as a trend at Dab on History is I'll take historical hypotheticals. So which totalitarian leader would be the most fun at a party? Obviously Joseph Stalin's being invited. Mao, Hitler, and I don't know why Hitler always makes it onto these terrible lists, but so Stalin, Mao, Hitler, and who else? Let's go with Lushenko, since he's a more current one.
I mean, just to say, this I've been looking forward to these questions so much after listening to several of your episodes.
God. Okay.
Stalin. I'm not a big drinker. I don't drink, and Stalin did like a drink.
Yeah. Hitler was a teetotaler.
Yeah.
So,
but he did do a lot of other stuff. I think I'm gonna go with Hitler. I think to find out all the information that we don't know would be really interesting from Hitler. But I'm absolutely fascinated with Stalin. So it's a tough call, but I don't think I could keep up with Stalin with the alcohol. So I'll go with Hitler.
So, Eric, who do you got?
Most fun at a party?
Yeah.
Mao does not look like any fun at all. I do think Stalin would be, he can let loose. I think Hitler was just too uptight. I feel like he was just too uptight. I think Stalin may have been able to let loose once in a while. He, his young picture, he looks pretty dashing. Looks like he had probably a good time. So I'm guessing he's going to be the most fun.
Okay. It's interesting. Wasn't Mao a teacher?
Yeah. He was librarian as well.
Pinning everything on us.
It's the teachers, man. He doesn't look fun. No, he looks like an assistant. He looks like a vice principal. That's what the problem is. He doesn't look fun. Yeah, I mean, if you're gonna party with anybody who's as terrible as those four, I'm probably going Stalin. He was one of the big three in World War II, and I'm guessing him, Churchill, and Roosevelt put a few back when they got done at the Yalta Accords. Yeah. So those are probably Stalin. He would be the one of those four that I would pick.
I would throw Kim Jong-un in there. I mean, anyone who's friends with Dennis Rodman, and
that's a good
my gosh, I forgot about that. Yeah.
I mean, he looks like he can bring the catering.
Oh, 100%. I haven't read a few things. He loves his sushi. He loves his basketball. I think you'd have a pretty sick day there. And he'd let you use rocket launchers.
And they're all a little crazy.
Point.
All these guys are a little crazy, but didn't he kill one of his generals with an artillery gun?
Yes.
A few years back, he lined up it was like his uncle. That's the problem. That party could get out of hand real quick. in North Korea.
Oh my gosh, that's awful.
I haven't read that article where he shot him with an artillery shell. I was both laughing in disbelief and horror.
Yeah.
As well, no, you couldn't possibly done that. And why is that your preferred method of execution at this point?
I mean, a lot of people have been executed over the humanity's history. I don't know if a lot of them have been executed with a howitzer. So.
If you have a monopoly of arms, you need to utilize that.
Yeah, what are they going to do? Just sit in a warehouse and collect dust?
It's such a juxtaposition as well, because the Russians used to line people up to save bullets. And there's Kim Jong-un using an artillery shell when people are starving. So you can see where the priority is.
Yeah. Wow, that's so wild.
That does sound like a very Soviet thing. You know, you got 3 soldiers, give them 1 gun, one ammunition clip. You've got 10 prisoners. Try to use as few bullets as possible.
And you've made them dig the hole, so you are saving.
Yeah, it's all about that.
They were very effective.
It's all about that collectivization. You gotta efficiency. Okay, I like it. That was really the only main question I had. Is Lukashenko, Kim Jong-un, Putin, or Xi Jinping? Which one of those 4 would you go punch in the face? And you got to deal with the consequences. So you punch him in the face.
I remember I said Genghis Khan's the last one.
You said Genghis Khan? Man, you're a brave guy.
Well, I took it into account that he was 5'8". You know, he was about half my weight.
Yeah, he's the one that did the
6
research.
inches shorter. So I thought, you know,
he had the Dungeons and Dragons stat cards on him, apparently.
Yeah.
I'm not punching Putin. I'm just not. He's trained in martial arts, ex-KGB. That'll be a brave decision.
He's going to slap you with that radium. Is that what they use?
The radium poisoning. Yeah, he's going to have radium lace gloves or something.
And there's that video of Putin going around teaching the kids how to flip an adult onto the martial arts mat. So it's
Russian primary school is way different than America.
He's like a black belt in Taekwondo or something. One of them. Yeah. I'm not going near him.
Okay.
Kim Jong-un.
Kim Jong-un.
Kim Jong-un.
Didn't he like study at Cambridge when he was younger? Like maybe it wasn't Cambridge, but he did come to some European, I thought it was in England, some university, and was kind of a bookish guy.
I just think he would, out of everyone, I know Lukashenko is a bit older, but I think out of everyone, I think he would take it the best.
Mm-hmm.
Although, like, you possibly getting killed later on.
You get an artillery, that's a chance.
I think you've got longer.
Okay.
Yeah, but you can outrun him. Like,
you can't outrun soldiers.
First of all, I'm not gonna break any of my knuckles on any bones of his. No. And second of all, I'm going to be able to outrun him pretty
Where are you
easily.
punching him, though? Where are you?
Ooh, right in that nose.
Right in the nose. Okay.
Yeah.
I think Kim Jong-un's the one.
Okay. So I'm going to take a different tack with my answer. I'm going to say Putin. Because I think Putin is the kind of guy that would respect somebody that punched him in the face. He might still wreck me, but I think Xi Jinping or Kim Jong-un, I don't think they would take kindly to getting punched in the face, and there would be very severe. But if I'm playing off this Russian bear type, I think they would be more okay with random punches in the face than not. And so I think my chances, I'm still going to get hurt, but I think they would respect it more so than
short-term pain over long-term.
Exactly. Yeah. Yeah. I think Kim Jong-un would make me suffer, and same thing with Xi. So, all right. That was my final historical hypothetical. So, but Jackson, thank you so much for joining us.
Jackson, where can people get the book, and when can they get the book, and where can they get to you on social media and all that kind of stuff?
So, I've got blurred background. The book is available on Amazon. It's available as a paperback, hardback, or a Kindle edition. I think the hardback is more widely available over your neck of the woods. But yeah, it's available on Amazon. If people do want a signed copy, they are on my website, but I'm just trying to sort out like shipping stuff because I've only had one order signed. So we'll sort that out. Anyone who wants one, just message me. And then I'm on Twitter as History W Jackson, Instagram and Facebook as @HistoryWithJackson. And then my website is www.historyofjackson.co.uk. And I'm more than happy to anyone message me with questions or anything about totalitarianism, because I just love chatting to people about it.
Well, thank you for joining us, because it was a really good book and it was really enlightening, and the conversation even more so.
Oh, thank you very much for having me. I'm really grateful for the opportunity. So thank you, guys. And Eric was wondering if he'd be able to understand me. So hopefully I've delivered a clearer conversation than he imagined.
I had my interpreter next to me the whole time.
It's going to be Dick Van Dyke from Mary Poppins or something. Like it's, no, it was awesome. But thank you so much. And for everyone else, thank you guys for joining us at Dad Bod History. And we'll see you all next week.